Hello and welcome to this crime and punishment revision video. This one focuses on the industrial period between 1750 and 1900. So firstly, we need to think about how life changes in this time period and potentially the impact that that's going to have on crime, law enforcement and punishment. Firstly, there's a huge increase in population. The population increases sixfold between 1750 and 1900. So by 1900, there's 37 million people in Britain. Mass industrialisation drives a huge change in the way people live their lives. People moving from the countryside, from villages, from rural areas into towns and cities. By 1900, the vast majority of Britain's population live in towns and cities. That's a complete role reversal from the earlier time periods we've studied. There's also a huge increase in the British Empire during this time period as well. The British Empire hits its peak in the 19th century, and Britain controls 1/5 of the world. There's also a huge growth in literacy and democracy, so more and more people are reading, more and more people are voting in this time period as well. By continuity from the earlier time periods, poverty, disease and miserable living conditions remain common and normal. So crime then in this time period. Petty theft once again remains the most common type of crime, and similarly to earlier time periods, opportunistic crime, opportunistic theft, people committing the crime when the chance appears, is normal. Around 3/4 of criminals were men, although there is a larger number of women that are prosecuted in this time period. The most common charge is prostitution. Because of the way people are living, there are new types of crimes to emerge, things like vandalism, things like fare dodging, not paying your train fare, things like business crimes, so things like embezzling money or fraud as things change. People's attitudes to crime are also really important in this time period. There's quite dramatic differences between how people view crime and criminals. One group is a group called the radical thinkers. So someone like John Glyde, who argued that actually the reason people commit crime is because of poverty, because of the poor living conditions that they're in, the poor upbringing they've had. That makes them likely to commit crime. Countering this were conservative views at the time, and they said that people who commit crime often have poor morals, were often drunks, and were often lazy. Indeed, there is the temperance movement in this time period who are advocating and promoting people not drinking, temperance, stopping drinking alcohol. And they basically claim that the vast majority of crime is driven by the consumption of alcohol, and that also poverty is caused by consumption of alcohol. So people are spending money on alcohol rather than on living standards. Some people also believe that criminals were born, that it was almost genetic, it was in their DNA. The photograph you can see shows a man holding his hands up. The reason for that is that people believed that you could tell a criminal just by looking at the shape of parts of their body, such as their hands. Ordinary people, however, in this time period are fascinated by crime, terrified by it, but also fascinated by it. There's a huge increase in the numbers of crime newspapers and crime news stories, illustrated newspapers that tell about particular crimes and cases. People could also buy penny dreadfuls, so short little pamphlets, 2 or 3 pages, with lots of illustrations that tell the story of a crime. You've also got people like Charles Dickens writing at this time, where crime plays a large role in the stories that he wrote. There's also quite significant changes to law enforcement in this time period as well. First of all, we're going to talk about the Bow Street runners. So when we start this time period in 1750, the people in towns that are responsible for the law are the parish constables and the watchmen. These people are only part-time, they only work at night, and they're often unpaid as well for their time. John Fielding was a magistrate, so a man who ran a court in Bow Street in London, and he set up the Bow Street Runners. These were paid constables whose job it was to go out into the streets and search for crime, find crime as it's happening, stop it, and bring the offenders to court. By 1800, there were 68 Bow Street Runners patrolling that part of London. As well as this, John Fielding set up a newspaper called the Hue and Cry. And what the Hue and Cry did is it detailed crimes that were unsolved, encouraging people to pass information on to the courts in the hope of solving crimes and tracking people down. Despite these positive steps, Fielding's proposals to expand the Bow Street Runners into other parts of the country were rejected. Ultimately, in the early part of this time period, in the late 18th century, people are fearful of the power that the government might have or a police force might have, and they're also fearful of the cost. However, with time, the police force does become established, largely due to rising crime in the early part of the 19th century. Robert Peel, who was the Home Secretary, set up the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829. Despite ongoing fears of the government using the police for repression and to control them, as well as high costs, the case for rising crime outweighed these worries. Initially, there are 3,000 officers, nicknamed Peelers or Bobbies after Robert Peel, and they wore a dark blue uniform and a tall hat. The only equipment they had was a truncheon. Later on, things like a whistle and notebook are added, but that is their equipment when they start. By 1835, there is a recognition of the success of the Metropolitan Police, and they passed something called the Municipal Corporations Act. This allowed towns across the country to set up their own police force, although attitudes again to this were quite negative and change was slow because people were fearful of the cost. In 1839, the government passed another law, this time the Rural Constabulary Act, and this allowed magistrates to set up a police force for their county. Although only 2/3 of counties actually did this by the 1850s, but we're now getting police forces working together across a larger area rather than just individual ones in certain towns. And by 1856, a third law was passed, the County and Borough Police Act, and this was the first step towards creating a national police force. It ensured that local police forces had to meet national standards, and they began to work more closely together and share information. So policing does develop during this time period as well. So after the initial setting up of the Metropolitan Police in 1829, in the last part of this time period in the late 19th century, there's some quite significant changes. Initially, the police were just there to respond to crime as it happened, preventing it as it happened, particularly things like drunkenness, prostitution and vagrancy. However, as time goes on, things like the detectives become more important. So the first ones are introduced in 1842, but by 1878 there's nearly 800 of them, and they have their own department. So detectives, police officers who are specifically employed to try and solve crimes rather than just responding to them. Furthermore, there's things like the photographing of crime scenes and fingerprinting that is used at the end of this time period. The police also begin to use telegraphs to send information more quickly in the 1860s. So the police begin to take advantage of new technologies that are being developed in the 19th century. So on to punishment then is our final part for the industrial period. Capital punishment, the death penalty, sees some quite significant changes here. People are concerned about the morality of actually executing criminals. More and more people are saying that it's inhumane to execute people, and particularly some of the brutal forms of execution that were common in the early modern period have no place in our civilized society in the 1800s. From 1780, the new drop was introduced in executions. This was when a trapdoor was placed in the gallows. So the prisoner would fall through the trapdoor, snapping their neck more quickly. It meant that execution and death came more quickly for the condemned. The government also massively reduces the number of capital crimes, so the number of crimes that you can actually be executed for in the 1800s. Remember from the last time period, 1688, we had the introduction of the Bloody Code that saw a huge increase in the number of capital crimes. That's greatly brought down. In 1868, the government also makes another important change. They make public executions illegal. This is because of the violence and the rowdiness and the poor behaviour that there is on execution days. So if we go back to earlier time periods where criminals were paraded through the streets before being hanged in the town square or the centre of the town, this led to, as I say, lots and lots of antisocial behaviour and disorderly behaviour. So initially, the government said that people could only be executed inside prison walls, so they started executing people on prison roofs so people could still see it but couldn't get as close. But from 1868, executions have to be done behind closed doors. People can't watch them anymore. And by 1872, the long drop is introduced. This calculates the exact length of rope required to instantly snap the neck of the person being hanged. This led to people dying far quicker through this measured length of rope. A particularly unique type of punishment to the industrial period is transportation. So this was used as an alternative to capital punishment. As people turn away from capital punishment, transportation starts to be used. This is when people are shipped off to other parts of the world. Initially America, before America becomes independent. After American independence, hulks, huge warships, are then used to house prisoners. These were just kept floating in the River Thames. Prisoners were kept inside, chained up. However, the problem is that this led to real bad outbreaks of disease, particularly typhus. So campaigners began to criticise these hulks floating in the Thames. The government then decides after 1780 to start sending people to Australia after its discovery by Europeans in the 1770s. Small crimes such as stealing bread could lead to transportation. So could political activism. So a group called the Tolpuddle Martyrs are transported for trying to form a trade union. People are sentenced between 7 and 14 years. After that, they are free, but most people can't afford to return back to Britain, so they start a new life in Australia. Conditions in the colony while people were prisoners were pretty brutal. They're put to work doing things like digging ditches, building roads, mining, real back-breaking work. There's a lack of clean water, a lack of sanitation, and harsh physical punishments are used to keep control, particularly whippings, floggings, beatings. As I say, though, some people did get to start a new life after their release, and there are some success stories of people who start their own businesses and rebuild a better life for themselves, and probably had a better opportunity to rebuild a new life in Australia than they would have done back home in Britain. From the 1830s, though, campaigners start to argue ultimately that transportation is inhumane, separating people away from their families, trapping them on the boat for weeks and weeks on end, and then the harsh conditions that are there. The Australian government also starts to complain. They are unsurprisingly not very happy about the numbers of British criminals that are being dumped there. There are some people back in Britain who actually argue that transportation isn't harsh enough and is a soft option, that these people should still be executed, but that's a limited number of people. From the 1830s, transportation does begin to decline. Prisons become more common then as a form of punishment in the 19th century. Prison reformers such as Elizabeth Fry, who you can see here, and John Howard, basically criticised the conditions in prisons. They're overcrowded, they're insanitary, and the prisons had to pay for everything they needed: food, water, blankets, coal for heating. John Howard is a prison reformer, and he basically suggests that prisoners should have their own cell, a separate cell, as well as the jailers being paid, so they don't have to make money from their prisoners because they're actually earning a wage. Elizabeth Fry focused on Newgate Prison and the conditions of the women in prison there. She was shocked by overcrowding, by disease, and also the numbers of children that were in prison, not because they themselves were criminals, but because their mothers had been sent to prison. So particularly young children, if their mother was sent to prison, the child went with her. She set up a school teaching women to read and write, sewing groups showing them how to mend clothes and repair things to try and give them a skill, as well as Bible study classes. She also promoted temperance, so abstinence from alcohol, not drinking, and she got alcohol banned in Newgate Prison. And our final part to think about then is the creation of the prison system. So Millbank Prison was the first large-scale prison created in 1816, but it was a massive failure. Discipline was a huge problem and the prison did not work. This was followed then in 1823 by the Jails Act. The government introduced this to regulate prisons. This meant that each prisoner was to have a separate cell. Justice of the Peace had to visit the jails and report on the conditions in there. So it was a way of trying to improve conditions. With the decline of transportation from the 1830s onwards, more and more people are being put into prison for crimes that they've committed as the punishment. So there's a huge increase in prison building in the 1840s. Pentonville Prison, a very famous one, was built in 1842, and by 1877, 90 prisons had either been built or rebuilt. Many of these prisons used something called the separate system, in which prisoners were kept apart from each other to reflect on their crimes. This often led to loneliness and mental breakdown. As you can see in the image there, their faces are covered so they can't even make eye contact with another prisoner. Their days were filled with essentially pointless work. The silent system followed this. This is where prisoners were kept obviously in complete silence. They were allowed to work alongside others but weren't allowed to speak. And this is where we get punishments or pointless physical exercise such as the treadmill, the crank, where people have to just walk or wind a wheel over and over again. Completely pointless, but a way of physically exhausting and breaking the spirits of prisoners. In 1865, the Prison Act was passed, and this emphasised hard labour, hard fare, hard board. This followed something called the garrotting panic in the early 1860s, where there was a series of murders in London where people were garrotted, strangled with ropes and cords. Prisons were made much harsher in response to this. Hard labour, so hard physical punishing work. Hard fare, fare's an old-fashioned word for food, so very, very basic harsh food. And hard board, literally a wooden plank to sleep on, the removal of all comforts or traces of humanity. So huge changes here to punishment in the industrial period as well.